We would like to welcome Dr. Charles Branas, the Chair of Department of Epidemiology at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, for his grand rounds on the disease of gun violence. Dr. Branas received his PhD at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. Throughout his career, he has pioneered work on geographic access to medical care across the United States and throughout the world, changing the healthcare landscape on a global scale. Dr. Branas' research on urban blight and health problems such as gun violence has contributed to multinational efforts to improve the health and safety of entire communities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Branas.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the welcome. And, in fact, very much the opportunity to come speak before a Department of Medicine. Typically, when I come to medical schools to talk, it's usually for a Department of Surgery or a Department of Emergency Medicine. So I welcome the opportunity to tell you more about gun violence, the issue of gun violence in the U.S. and around the world, and why I think, and finally, I think people are starting to buy into this idea of it being a disease, a biomedical issue, and a public health problem. Let me start by giving you a bit of a parable. So U.S. births and deaths in 2010, the U.S. had about 310 million people. About 4 million people were born, and about 2.5 million people died in the United States. For the first time in U.S. history, we had about one gun per person in the U.S., and our firearms were born, that is, manufactured at a higher rate than our people, and they died at a much lower rate. So their fertility was pretty good, and their turnover was pretty good, and I'm not a demographer, but this is where we're going. Where we're going to have, at some point in the not-too-distant future, perhaps 2 guns per person in the United States. So we are awash with firearms, and the question is becoming very much so these past 5 years, although some of us have been asking it for the past 25 years. Does anyone have any better ideas of what to do here? So I want to go through some options that we've talked about and some traditional options that have been talked about and get your input on them. And perhaps at the end get your thoughts on some creative ideas that might emerge. So one of the issues and one of the problems of why we are so intransigent on this issue is the challenge of red and blue America, which has been brought out in several of the past presidential elections. But in red and blue America, guns are a top contentious issue. We continue to have this problem of a schism between urban cosmopolitans and rural traditionalists. And by the way, it's not just the general public that is disagreeing on this. Scientists also disagree quite a bit, and some of that debate gets very, very nasty among different scientific groups. And a base question that's running through all of this is, are guns protective or perilous? I want to tell you that it is a two-sided scientific test. So many people think, and many scientists think, that we should be testing their issue of they're simply perilous and just how perilous are they. But there's definitely an argument to be made about the protective effect of guns. You can think about this anytime you see a police officer and them carrying a firearm. So with respect to the contentious issue here among the public, this is 20 different topics in the U.S., and the number of people who are not willing to listen to the other side. And guns here are number 3, and they're set apart from all the other issues on how high they are. And in fact, this is about a decade old, this survey. The gay marriage has actually dropped down on this, and guns are now a top 2 issue among the U.S. public of folks who are not willing to listen to the other side. So not only do we have a disagreement, but we have a disagreement where people aren't willing to take in evidence one way or the other. Now, this challenge is most active in this issue of urban cosmopolitans and rural traditionalists. that is, city dwellers like you, and folks who come from small town America. And we had done a study over a decade ago, and this still holds today, that in fact, and it's surprising to a lot of people still today, that we have more gun suicides in the United States every year than we have gun homicides. And that the gun suicide rate, as you move away from big cities and into small towns in rural America, goes up steadily. So that in fact, your risk of gun suicide in rural America is higher than your risk of gun homicide in urban America. But that doesn't mean these two groups, urban cosmopolitans and rural traditionalists, recognize the same type of problem for the United States. I mean, I did a lot of field work at one point on this study, going to rural counties across the US and meeting with coroners and medical examiners who sometimes, frankly, asked us to come out to investigate their gun homicide problem. Almost always the gun homicide problem that was being perpetrated by Mexican immigrants coming across the border and up into their state. We never once found an act of gun homicide in their counties, much less one that was committed by Mexican immigrants. What we did find in each of these counties was a very high gun suicide rate. In fact, the New York Times covered this in 2005, where they quoted one of the coroners in fact, the county with the highest gun suicide rate in the nation as saying that he didn't know about any gun suicides, that this was not a problem and that it was something that he was unaware of. Now, this is the person who signs the death certificates in the county. So I think there's a big lack of recognition that among urban cosmopolitans that this is an issue outside of cities to begin with, much less among rural traditionalists who are not seeing the issue that is right in their backyard of gun suicide. So that's urban cosmopolitans and rural traditionalists is one issue, big cities and small towns. And then when you ask people, do you think having a gun in the house makes it a safer place or a more dangerous place to be, this is how the US breaks out. So this is red and blue America. So there are definite differences in opinion of what the answer to this question is. Now, scientifically, we finally have accumulated a decent body of evidence on this from 6 or 7 case control studies, which have their limitations, by the way, but have come down on, and if you look at this, again, these are two-sided tests, are guns protective or perilous, and if you come down on it, having a gun in your possession, owning it, or in the home about doubles your risk of gun homicide. Now, we did one of these studies. The final study in 2009 was ours. And when this study came out, again, this was a question of gun possession and being shot with a firearm, the risk of being shot with a firearm, injured with a gun. It didn't stop the NRA from putting this on the cover of the American Rifleman that goes out to their 5 million members. And I always show this in class as a question to my students. What's wrong with this title? I'm going to be a little interactive. Do any of you see a problem with this title in the case control study? What was our outcome? Yeah, deaths and being shot with a firearm. Gun ownership was our exposure. We were not claiming that gun ownership was a disease. In fact, quite the opposite. But that didn't stop the lobby from labeling that and using this as an opportunity to say that the public health and the biomedical community were targeting gun owners, which we were not. So there's also a misunderstanding among the lobby, perhaps purposeful, but a misunderstanding among the lobby, who I did talk to and explain this, and they did not understand the study, in fact. But this misunderstanding goes rather deep. Now, one of the challenges, and this has also been put forward by the lobby and various people in Congress, is that we have very few scientists that have entered into the field of gun violence research. And there were few to begin with. I went to a National Academy of Sciences meeting about 4 or 5 years ago in a room about half the size of this room. All of us were in the room, and the joke was if someone set a bomb off in this room, it would end the field immediately. And so there have been very few scientists, and the challenge has been, with not a ban at the Centers for Disease Control, that's a misconception, but there's language that is threatening enough that enters into every CDC grant application, proposal application, that has prevented additional gun violence research. This is a study in 2017 by Ted Alcorn in the Journal of the American Medical Association, where you can see in the blue are publications of firearm violence research, and you can see how those had a precipitous drop after 1997 when the CDC language was entered into the proposals. And that is a significant drop, while the red line is academic publications have grown dramatically. In fact, we have one publication every 14 seconds with all the new journals that are coming out. But gun violence research has taken a drop. Now, of later years, starting about 2015, that has changed, and has changed, thankfully, because of an awareness campaign that many of us were putting forward. New young scientists are entering the field, not nearly enough, but part of it is actually medicine, in the field of medicine. And I have to thank, for instance, JAMA Internal Medicine, which has set aside a significant portion of its articles and readership to gun violence research. And that has been a big boon, and there are other journals as well that have taken this up. So the blue lines are actually coming up now. But we're nowhere near where we should be given the size of the problem. And the other issue is the severe underfunding of this issue. Now, we have about 100,000 shootings in the US every year. That's about 1 million shootings a decade. Major NIH awards to this problem are about one major award for every 1 million cases per decade. That's a huge underfunding issue. And then when you compare it to other things like polio, for instance, where you've had about one award for every 2 cases per decade. I mean, these are massive, disproportionate sizes in terms of how much funding is going to this. And this is occurring both at the CDC, which is frankly a relatively tiny funding agency compared to the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest funding agency on the planet. And if we could get the NIH behind a little more funding for this, even a little bit more funding, we might be able to have more advances in prevention of gun violence. Now, in response to the Newtown shooting, that unfortunate tragedy, the University of Chicago and over 100 scientists, most of which actually were from the University of Pennsylvania, which is where I was at the time, penned a letter to the Vice Presidential Biden Commission on Gun Violence in the US. This actually led to an executive order asking for many things, including legal changes. But the one thing that emerged from this was a clear statement that gun violence is not only a law enforcement and justice issue, but that it is also very much a public health and medical issue in that statement. And that led to, on the far right here, the first program announcement from the National Institutes of Health specifically focused on gun violence, using the words firearm violence in the title of the announcement. Now, unfortunately, so that actually led to a number of new studies, but it only lasted for 3 years, and unfortunately, it has since been sunsetted at the National Institutes of Health. And we very much would like to see this program announcement or similar program announcements get reintroduced. So the question then becomes, can we find what works and then actually implement it? We know that there are numerous laws. Probably the one that comes to mind very readily are assault weapons bans and high-capacity magazine laws. And these have some value. But it's unclear, quite frankly, what the value of these laws is, and the scientific evidence is mixed on assault weapons bans. And I'm quoting a very recent, by the way, RAND report evaluating all gun laws in the US, and it's not the first of its kind, but the bottom line is that there's it's mixed findings in terms of what laws we have that actually work. Background check laws work, but they mostly work to reduce, and very importantly, gun suicide. Child access prevention laws work actually quite well for unintentional gun injury among children. And as do, there's some promise in terms of gun violence and domestic violence restraining orders that have been shown to have some promise. We also have been, but there's many, many laws, by the way, that do not work and that we don't have evidence for, yet people are promoting them. One of the other things that has not been tested that we have been talking about quite a bit is taking advantage of the relationship of alcohol and gun violence. And there is a strong connection between the two. While we have done a lot of great research to prevent drunk driving, and that's come down in many states, we have little research or legal laws in terms of drunk firing and what to do with someone who has a firearm who's been drinking. Whether that be actual possession of a firearm in public and consuming alcohol, or whether that be no guns in bars. And in fact, the guns in bars laws, of which there were almost half of the states had a no guns in bars and taverns laws. That has been reduced to a handful of states at this point. So states are removing those laws and perhaps going in the other direction. And it's unclear why, or if that's really a smart thing to do. Now, I have to also say that what else works? Well, you work. The medical system works, and we have good evidence that trauma care and trauma systems most certainly save lives. Perhaps as much as a 15 to 20% mortality benefit if you can get to a level 1 trauma center and you're shot with a firearm. So this is really important question. Other things work very much. Policing works. Different forms of policing work. And to some extent, non-police violence interrupters work, although the evidence is mixed. Now, for policing and for the medical system, these do work, but they are reactive. And we want to begin to think not only about treating people once they've been shot or managing a situation once it occurs, but preventing it from happening in the first place. And then there's issues of training and just the general culture of gun safety. I want to say this is a new study that we are just having reviewed right now. There's a lot of, as I was saying, it's unclear what specific gun laws work, and a handful perhaps do. Most do, we don't have evidence that they do. But there's been a series of studies looking at states, across states in general, whether those states, the body of laws in those states, and whether the body of laws is either, can be graded as largely permissive or largely restrictive in terms of firearms. There's a lot of studies now showing that more restrictive states have significantly less firearm injury of all types. This is a recent one that we did, looking not at all shootings, but looking at mass shootings. That is, instances of 4 or more people shot in the same event. And it's interesting to see that the permissive states, on average, are higher across this 20-plus year period, 25-year period, yeah? And that the restrictive states are lower, but I think what's very interesting that we've been trying to find an explanation for, somewhere around 2010, the two really started to diverge. And why is that? And so this is more of a question of just the general culture of firearms in a state, and even if the specific laws aren't working, is there some sort of symbolism of having laws in the state that changes the culture of weapons and firearms in that state in general, and that may lead to better outcomes, fewer shootings in the state, whether they be day-to-day shootings or mass shootings. Now, I'm going to argue that gun injury is a biomedical disease. So this was something that was very much opposed by a lot of folks in the lobby. But in fact, it went all the way up to the NIH, where Francis Collins penned a letter saying that, well, this is indeed a biomedical challenge that the NIH should be pursuing, as should the Centers for Disease Control, because when you're shot, there's not only a response by police officers, but you will go to a trauma center or a local hospital when you're shot, almost always. Yeah? And if you don't survive long enough to get to the hospital, there will be a medical examiner that will see you. So the disease of gun violence uses medical resources by necessity, and by definition then is a biomedical and public health problem. Now, you can compare it from an epidemiologist standpoint. I very much think about infectious diseases as well, and you can compare it to something like malaria or dengue, where there's a mosquito that's transmitting a pathogen into a host, and that there's a swampy environment that's promoting that vector and agent. It's the same thing for gun violence, and we want to begin to think about it in this epidemiologic triad model. And we know that, for instance, there's been a lot of success working with the mosquito and working with the host, but we've forgotten about thinking about the environment. And what does the environment do? And we know that the environment here for malaria and dengue, there is value to dealing with the swamp, yeah? To filling it in and stopping the mosquitoes from producing in the first place. And we think there's similar value for firearm violence. And that this value can be something, there might be opportunities for environments that promote gun violence, for changing those environments that can be apolitical, can be easily implemented, and can be inexpensive. And let me show you some of these. And part of this, and part of what drove us to this, was this notion. This is the health impact pyramid. How many of you have seen the health impact pyramid? This is Tom Frieden, your former health commissioner, who went on to be the CDC commissioner. So the health impact pyramid is what do you get on a public health level for different types of interventions? And counseling and education, for instance, at the top of the pyramid will get you some return in terms of impact. Medical care, clinical interventions will get you some additional return. Longer lasting interventions like vaccine campaigns will get you a little bit more. But then as you move down the pyramid, where the interventions actually become more challenging to implement, the return on investment, though, can be quite a bit higher. And so the one in particular, second from the bottom, that we've been focusing on is changing the context or the places around which different health problems occur, in this case gun violence, and making default decisions healthy. Yeah? So that is making changes that don't require anyone in the environment to do anything. They just gain the benefit of the change. They're not being asked to alter their behavior per se in an active way, or they're not being asked to remember to adhere to a particular regimen. Yeah? So we think this focus on places might be a real opportunity for gun violence prevention. And so part of this is my lab and my group has been thinking quite a bit about place-based solutions to firearms, whether those be abandoned buildings or vacant lots, which I will tell you a bit more about in a second. That can be alcohol sales environments, that can be business improvement districts, or changes to transportation systems. Does anyone know what this is a map of?
Switzerland.
Oh, awesome. You're the first person who got it right away. Are you Swiss?
I am Swiss.
Awesome. Well, suffice it to say that Americans rarely get this. And ask me if it's like a portion of Alaska or something. So this is Switzerland. If you take up in our major cities in the US and add up all the vacant and abandoned spaces in the United States in our cities, they add up to a land area the size of Switzerland. So it's a massive amount of space of abandoned buildings and vacant lots in our cities that are unused and are generating problems. However, I like to look at Switzerland and this Switzerland-sized area as an opportunity for the US. Yeah? If we take these areas and begin to think more about changing them in inexpensive ways, but in very repetitive ways with protocols. So this is work that we're doing in cities like Philadelphia, New Orleans, Newark, where we're taking vacant lots, vacant land that has been abandoned for decades, perhaps in some cases half a century, on the left side of your screen, through a very inexpensive process that involves members of the community, involves being paid to do this. This is not volunteer work. Involves local contractors from the neighborhoods, who come in and in a very quick process will change a land area like these vacant lots, perhaps within a week or two. We'll change them. And you can imagine if there's a block you live on and there are perhaps 20 of these spaces on your block, if 10 of those can be altered from the left to the right in an inexpensive and rapid way, that's a huge change on your day-to-day existence. When you come out to go to work or school each morning, it's a big shift. And people, by the way, for the cardiologists in the room, we also have studies here that people fear these spaces quite a bit. They won't cross the street to avoid these spaces because they either think the building's going to collapse on them or that someone's going to jump out of the abandoned space and attack them. And we have studies of repetitive increases in heart rate, people having all kinds of stress reactions when in proximity to these spaces. And so if you can change these spaces and change them in large degree in a rapid way, from the left to the right again, whether it be, by the way, I just showed you the vacant lot procedure, but we also have a protocol for abandoned buildings where we clean the facade, we change the windows and the doors on the building and clean up in front of the building. If you can change these, what we're finding is a 30 to 40% sustained reduction, at least for the course of the study, in some cases as much as 3.5 years, in gun violence. And we're also finding, because these have been chosen to be very inexpensive shifts to the spaces, they cost about $1.25 a square foot, perhaps, for the vacant lots. It's a very inexpensive thing. The average lot is about 1,000 square feet. Maintenance is about $0.05 a year thereafter per square foot. So every dollar in is about a $25 return just on the policing and medical care costs. And if you look at the societal return of the cost of gun violence, which is very expensive, the societal return goes into the hundreds of dollars for every dollar invested in these sorts of treatments. Now, we have 2 active federally funded randomized control trials that are going on right now. One, actually, the vacant lot trial is coming to conclusion. We've just put a paper in PNAS, and another one will be coming out in JAMA. We did that with about 600 vacant lots in the city of Philadelphia. Another one of those is following in the city of New Orleans and in Newark and Camden right now. And then we have a second trial that is in the midst of its treatment period on abandoned buildings in the city of Philadelphia for these. Now, for the vacant lot work, the findings are significant. And by the way, we've done a series of observational work prior to this in a number of cities. And this is what we're calling win-win-win science. So the significant results here are that the first win is that, well, you have nuisance crimes go down, things like noise complaints, public drunkenness and things of that nature go down by a significant amount, about 30%. But firearm assaults, gun injuries go down by a significant amount. And in this study, we had about 1.5 years. Actually, we're now doing a second analysis and finding the same thing for 2.5 years out, that gun violence goes down and stays down when the vacant lots are treated. So that's the first win. The second win is this issue of co-benefits. So not only when you make these changes to places, not only does gun violence go down and other little nuisance crimes, but neighbors begin to start to come out of their homes, begin to say that they're sharing their neighbors' values and that they're interacting more, they go outside more, they relax outside more. They also, not only is real crime going down, but the perception of crime and vandalism is going down by a significant amount. And then we have a study coming out soon on reductions in various mental health issues. So in general, mental health indicators are going down, particularly driven by a reduction in depression when you change people's environments like this. So that's the first 2 wins. The third win in this, though, is that these are largely apolitical. So for instance, the gun lobby, who will not come out in support of this, has privately told me that they're not going to oppose this, that this is a good direction because it's not involving gun owners. You know, part of the way this works is these vacant and abandoned spaces. Let me see if I can get you a picture of one again. These vacant and abandoned spaces here on the left, so there's a broken windows kind of theory going on here, that when you change them, when you alter them, people take more interest in the surrounding area and will act as informal police. They don't call the police, But if is there some sort of nuisance or something like that, they will move people away from that area and ask them not to have that activity here. So that's the one thing. But the other thing is these spaces, we know from police and from community members, and we've had a number of anthropologists follow these areas in various cities. These areas are what the police call storage lockers for illegal firearms. So something to understand is that many of these neighborhoods are places where illegal drugs are being moved as well, are being trafficked. Believe it or not, folks who are in the illegal drug market are not users of their product, by and large. They want to keep a clear head. They're running a business just like anyone else. And in fact, they have business disputes just like anyone else. But they can't call 911 or exercise the legal system when they have a business dispute. So they must have a firearm, but many of them have prior arrests. They can't carry that firearm on them. And again, talking to folks, many of them don't want that gun in their home because they have kids in their home. So they're looking for outdoor spaces, particularly disheveled and blighted outdoor spaces to store those firearms, and this is where they end up putting them. I mean, we have pictures, we're doing some work in Chicago right now, where in fact, numerous groups will paint a gun on an abandoned building as the place where all the guns are kept for the gang. So there's very obvious storage issues going on, and when you remove these, that's one of the main reasons we think that we're having such an effect on gun violence in these neighborhoods. So I'll also say that this has progressed to various cities around the country who are taking an interest in this. Our partners at Rutgers, at Hampton University, at the University of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio State, and Medical College of Wisconsin have taken a great interest in this. Oh, and Tulane, of course, I shouldn't forget them, as well as this has entered into the language for Healthy People 2020 with the Assistant Secretary's Office. They've taken a great interest in this treatment of places, not just to prevent gun violence, but for a number of other issues and co-benefits that also may occur. So Purple America, I'll close with this little bit. So I told you about Red and Blue America, but if we can get people to move past that and think about what is it in Purple America that we need to recognize and move forward. So we need to begin to think about the fact that we have more guns than the next 10 highest nations combined, that we have about 100,000 people shot each year, more than any other industrialized nations, and about 30,000 of those are children. I mean, these are sobering statistics, and that we spend about $100 billion each year for our gun violence problem. But the challenge is going to be finding solutions that everyone can get behind, given these figures. So in Purple America, most people, in fact, despite their disagreements about firearms themselves, think that gun violence is a serious problem. So I don't want you to forget that. And so most people are open to this idea that we have a problem facing us and that we need to figure out something to do about it. And when you take those urban cosmopolitans and the rural traditionalists here, the blue and the red lines, if you add those lines together, and this was the message of our paper ultimately, what you find is a relatively flat line going from big cities to small towns. So this is everybody's problem, and we need to start talking about it that way. This is not only a big city problem or a small town problem in any particular way. So I'll close by saying we have a unique public health and biomedical crisis of constitutional significance. I don't think there's a constitutional amendment for anything else that we're being faced with right now. So this is a major issue of significance to the United States. So all communities and all Americans are at risk. We need to begin recognizing that. At risk of gun violence, just like cancer, just like heart disease, and just like the flu. We have one gun per person in the US, and we need to creatively come up with effective, yet realistic and practical solutions to gun violence. And we must begin to resource our scientific study of this issue. It has to happen, and we need to start raising the study of gun violence as a disease to the same level that we do for other major disease entities in the US. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time to talk.
Questions? Switzerland as mapped, but of course it approaches the U.S. in the rate of gun ownership. And yet
Yes.
the number of mass shootings is very, very low.
Yes.
But we can't really look at Switzerland to help us solve our problems. I mean, based on what you told us, we have to come up with our own solutions.
We do, and there are other countries that also have ownership that's extremely high. And I want to say that if you look at the Swiss, if you look at Israel, perhaps, is another example of high-ish gun ownership. Other countries as well. I'm trying to think of other ones. Norway is another good example of high gun. What's that? Iceland. The bar to get a firearm is very different in those countries. You know, we have in this country, so the state I came from, Pennsylvania, the bar is extremely low. There aren't long-term waiting periods and mental health checks and other issues that you have to pass in a country like Switzerland or Norway in terms of getting a firearm. Yes, ownership is high, but the bar for distribution of those firearms is also quite high. And we have some states that have a very high bar in terms of getting a firearm, but many do not, and now we're even eroding that further with things like reciprocity laws. So if, for instance, even if Pennsylvania has a somewhat high bar, it has now a reciprocity law, which means if you don't like the law in Pennsylvania, you can go to the state of least, that's the least restrictive, and that is probably a state like Florida, and just use their law. So it's becoming a bit of a challenge in that regard, and I think that we can look to these other countries for some examples of what we might bring here in the U.S., but we still have a unique problem relative to these other countries. Thanks for that question.
Thank you. Age is an obvious factor in this disaster situation. Most of the killers are young, and most of the unfortunate recipients of the bullets are young. Are you or your colleagues looking at age with regard to, and I think frankly if I could only interview one age group, I'd interview the older person to find out why they are not doing some of the killing. But I don't understand why this is not part of your research.
So let me tell you, I thought you were going to ask me a different question. I thought you were going to say the older people are doing the killing by and large. So are any of you familiar with the opioid crisis, right? And that has come up, and this idea of deaths of despair. We had Angus Deaton visit us a couple months ago at Columbia, and he gave this talk about, well, there's a plateauing of life expectancy in the U.S. because of opioids. But what he left out there, which is also part of his research, is the number two thing after that is suicide. And that's being driven by gun suicide, which is perhaps the most lethal form of suicide, by and large, in the United States. And that's being largely committed by older Americans, 55 plus. So I'm trying to answer your question. So I do think that there's an age issue, and the age issue for suicide, at least, is about focusing on older ages and what we can do about older Americans and their ownership of a firearm. So you want me to answer the question about interpersonal shootings, right? And people shooting each other.
Why are all the killers young, and why are the older people not doing this? I would interview the old people and ask them.
Okay. We could take a look at older folks and why they're not shooters, I suppose.
Does Columbia have a gerontology or geriatric program?
We do, I think, yeah. I mean, we bring them in. I think it would be an interesting question to begin to talk more to older folks, and especially, I think we can learn a lot from older gun owners, frankly, if you want my opinion. Older gun owners, believe it or not, and I don't want this to be reflected in my talk, I think they're some of the most safety-conscious individuals that I've met, right? So how can we bottle that for that group of older gun owners, for their safety consciousness, and begin to transfer that to others? I think that would be very important. I hope that gets to your question.
What has been the track record of translating these impressive scientific data into public policy?
So well, I will say that for the laws, I mean, it's direct. So when a study comes out, when an opportunity to study a law comes out, there's a movement to study it. The results come out, and policymakers immediately see it. Part of the issue is that I think as a scientific community that we're reacting to what legislators do, as opposed to beginning to put forward our own ideas for interventions, whether those be legislative interventions, whether those be individual level interventions, perhaps using the medical system as part of that opportunity, or whether those be interventions like I was telling you, where you change spaces in cities. I think we need to be a bit more creative instead of following what the legislative community do and just testing what they implement, really getting in the door with them and making recommendations about what should be implemented so that we can test it. Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
Hi.
You mentioned broken windows theory.
Yes.
And I'm a medical student, but I've learned about sort of the critiques of broken windows theory.
Yeah.
And while it might be nice to create these beautiful environments, it can lead to worsening police practices, more discrimination. It can lead to perpetuating these notions of a culture
I wanna-
of poverty. Can I finish?
Go ahead.
Like a culture of poverty, and saying that these people are doing it to themselves and sort of ignoring the systemic racism and things that are creating the violence that's happening, and can lead to gentrification by saying that now that these places are nicer, white people can move in. So I'm just curious how you might respond to that. Sort of it's nice to start here because it's on a cheaper side, but sort of how you respond to the critiques of broken windows.
It's a great question. So my first answer is that I mentioned broken windows theory, which is different than broken windows policing. So broken windows theory, which relates to policing, is not what I'm showing you here. So what I'm showing you here is an empowerment strategy to move people who are in deeply impoverished neighborhoods, absent any police involvement, frankly. So this does not bring police into their neighborhood at all. In fact, when you talk to police departments in various cities, they very much support this work because it saves them resources and they don't have to, the changes in environments, it saves them resources and they can put fewer police officers in those neighborhoods. So I want to make a distinction between broken windows theory and broken windows policing. I want to be very clear about that there is a difference and that we're not encouraging police practices in these neighborhoods. In fact, doing the opposite.
But in the past, it has led to further policing.
Changes to environments like this? I don't know of
The
an...
critique of broken windows theory is that it leads to more.
Broken windows theory, the way it's been applied in cities from the 90s, the way it's been applied in cities like New York, in terms of enhancing police practices to police particularly nuisance issues, that has led to increasing police practices, some of which have not been advisable. My use of it as a theory here has nothing to do with that, to be clear. So we're changing environments not with the intent of bringing more police into these environments. And in fact, we have evidence that that's not occurring. The intent is to bring fewer police into those environments. And the informal policing I'm telling you about is to have the neighbors, once you change a space for a neighborhood, that it's been like that for 40 years, the neighbors don't want it to go back. In the most impoverished neighborhoods, they really appreciate it. One of the things that I think was so eye-opening for me is we're a university coming in with NIH money to change these spaces. The common reaction from the neighborhood is, we've been calling you for 30 years to do something about this space. Thank you, the city of whatever, for coming, right? So completely mistaking us and wanting the city to come in and do something about it. Now, I do think your comment about gentrification is an immensely valid comment. So when these spaces change, there is the potential for something to look nicer and for developers to dive in and start to move these spaces to increase property taxes, to increase property values, and that changes the nature of that environment. And I think as New Yorkers, you've experienced that in a very acute way. We haven't done much work in New York, if any, on this, but cities like Philadelphia or New Orleans, What we know is when these places change, we can't find, except with one neighborhood exception of 70 neighborhoods in the city of Philadelphia, we can't find evidence of any gentrification. And in fact, of all these places, the vacant lots, for instance, even the abandoned buildings, only about 5% of them ever got developed. And they were all concentrated in one neighborhood. So the vast majority of these, and that was not a highly impoverished neighborhood to begin with. The poorest neighborhoods of Philadelphia and New Orleans that are receiving these treatments, for decades, these stay, at least for a decade that we've been following them, these stay as parks for use by the local neighbors. Property taxes do not go up. If anything, perhaps they remain stable or go down in certain neighborhoods. So the evidence that this is leading these sort of inexpensive shifts, remember, these are not luxury developments. We're not building parks as large expensive parks as destination amenities for folks outside the neighborhood. This is literally the abandoned space right next to your house. We don't think that it's by and large overwhelmingly led to gentrification. We think there's real opportunity there. Thanks for your question. It's really good.
The suicide issue, I think, has been dramatically underappreciated. It's my understanding that suicide attempts are not different in the U.S. than elsewhere. It's just that success is greater because of the access to firearms. And I wonder more about the demographics there, but in particular, giving voice to the families of the victims of suicide to make sure that people don't lose sight of the impact, because I think that would be a better balance than a lot of what's been done in terms of public perception.
Yeah, I very much agree. I mean, there's the Out of the Darkness movement has been really a positive thing to raise awareness about suicide in general. I mean, we need to begin to start talking about this and start talking about firearms as a chief cause of this, and begin to think about moving guns out of the environment of folks who might be at risk, who might be, ideating, or in other cases talking about suicide. And the family is the best opportunity, actually, to begin to detect that. So I appreciate that. It's kind of a lackluster answer to your question, because I think we haven't done enough here. This is literally, we are just getting started in our gun suicide prevention and beginning to think about some overarching issues, whether they be family issues, whether they be issues of geographic isolation, and we don't have a robust set of interventions for this, quite frankly.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, your vacant lot work is extremely exciting. Have you been able to look at the dose required? Meaning, is it one lot transforms one street? Is it 10 lots transform one zip code? Like, what do you need to get your results?
Yeah, sorry, I just glossed over details. Your question's a great one. The answer is we don't know, and we're looking into it. The findings I showed you were for a dosage of 5 lots on a block that are clustered on a block, right? So 5, and you can imagine the average block in cities like New Orleans and Philadelphia have maybe a dozen, something like that, 10 to 12. So we do about 50% of the spaces on a block. But yes, I don't know. I would love to find that tipping point. So we know that there's action at 5, perhaps there's even more at 6 and 7, or maybe we could get a decent amount of reduction in return at 2 or 3. It's a great question. We're looking into it right now, actually.
Have you looked at empowering citizens using 311 app or telephone as a way to maintain these neighborhoods without getting grants from government to do it, but actually using government to fix it and maintain it?
Yeah, one of the things that we saw some action with was, in terms of an outcome, was people's report of trust in government. Now, it wasn't exactly significant, but there was an increase in people's trust in their government, which we think leads to more 311 calls. We haven't looked at that. In fact, 311 as an intervention, I think, is what you're suggesting. We've been trying to look at it as an outcome to see, areas where people call 311 more after we do these things. But I think that it's fascinating, and the use of 311. I'll tell you, when you go into extremely impoverished neighborhoods and you talk to folks on the street, the vast majority of them have no idea about 311, to be quite honest with you. So we have a large education campaign if we want to get 311 off the ground in a lot of these areas.
These were very impressive statistics that you mentioned. I wonder if the academic community should in a way encourage grassroots movements to try to control and decrease the influence of the NRA and the gun dealers. Because it seems that every study is intellectually extremely interesting, but one could homologate it to putting Band-Aids. The real problem is one step back. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
I think it's, you know, the academic, little academic, when I was a graduate student, there was attempts to do this. There was, in fact, attempts with the manufacturers at tort reform for years in terms of holding the manufacturers, the firearm manufacturers liable. And those were very challenging. I do think that the academic community, so one of the things that the lobby wants is less science because they're just opposed to it because it often finds stuff that they don't want. Sometimes, frankly, it does find findings are in support of them. Now, we need balanced science, and scientists need to take a stand. If there's a finding that a gun or some version of firearm training or something like that is protective, then we need to take a stand and report that out. But I'd say on balance, it hasn't been that way. And but I think if there's one thing the scientific and academic community can do is advocate for greater support of research and greater investment in research and getting that not only to policymakers, but finding a way to get it to the lobby. I'm part of a new gun consortium. I'll close on this and just say, part of a new gun consortium, which is a series of universities around the country, but has overtly invited various gun lobbying groups. And by the way, it's not just the NRA. There are dozens of gun rights groups around the country. The NRA has not joined us yet. They are obviously the largest, but several others have. And perhaps several that are politically to the right of the NRA have. And this kind of dialogue, I think, will be very, very important because these groups are also very much amenable to evidence, to be very honest with you. So thanks for your comment.
So I invite anyone else up for questions, and we'll thank our speaker.